getting this in just under the wire. But we've been talking all offseason about the Big 12 in 2024 being the year of the running back. And I know that last year was, but I feel like last year was a bit of a teaser. This year, even with it being a 16-team conference, the running back depth in the Big 12 is incredible, top to bottom. So many teams with an argument. We talked about this on our Monday episode about running back duos, but I mean, there's just so many conversations to have about running back position in the Big 12 conference this season because it is absolutely loaded. So I'm very excited to have on Justin Leo of Volume Pigs, one of the Substack newsletters that I subscribe to, does a great job covering college football, specifically from the fantasy side, which I thought was a unique angle to talk about. Justin, welcome to the 1012.
Hey man, yeah, I appreciate you having me on. Really excited to chat today. I mean, I love running backs. Anybody who knows me knows that's my favorite position. So I think the Big 12, I agree. This is going to be a special year for that position.
I mean, when you see kind of national stuff to put out during the offseason, the Big 12 had plenty of running backs mentioned. Obviously, Ollie Gordon, you see Taj Brooks, you see some Devin Neal, among with, Ohio State's running backs and other national contenders who have their five-star blue blood running backs as well. But where do you feel like the Big 12 as a conference stacks up with the rest of the country heading into this season?
Well, the Big 12 is unique. I mean, it's such a huge conference that I think in terms of, the depth of quality running backs, sort of from top to bottom, I would say, and you mentioned it, I sort of approach college football from a fantasy football angle. Certainly from a fantasy angle, I think the Big 12 top to bottom is the best conference for running backs. If we're talking generally just from a football perspective, I mean, they have some guys at that top end that you can, as you said, put in the category of basically anybody. I mean, Ollie Gordon has as good a chance to be drafted as the first running back probably as anybody in the next NFL draft. You have some others in the conference who were sort of rounded out nicely. Devin Neal's another one people are excited about. But certainly, I think this is a conference where when you look at production at the end of the year, I think, you're going to see that the top 20 running backs, top 25 running backs in college football in terms of yardage and touchdowns, it's going to be a lot of Big 12 running backs, assuming nobody gets hurt or most of them don't get hurt. They should be populating that leaderboard by the end of the season.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We'll talk a little offensive line as we get into this. I do want to ask you a question. It was a question that we had on our show on Monday of running back rooms, right? How do you decide what's a good running back room? And I'm curious where you put the value. I look at like Phil Steele's magazine. He has Oklahoma State number 3 as far as running back rooms because of Ollie Gordon. But and no offense to Trent Howland, but like there's no one behind Ollie that I'm like super. If Ollie goes down, you're not like you're worried about this offense, right? Versus say a UCF where you have an RJ Harvey who's really good, backed up by Penny Boone, who we've already seen be a stud as a starter. Or you look at West Virginia, Jaheim White and CJ Donaldson. So I'm curious from your standpoint, when you look at a running back room and want to grade them, what is more important to you? Actual depth or having a number one guy, like a true number one, he's going to get you the yards when you need him kind of guy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can answer this from a few different angles. I mean, from a fantasy angle, the answer is sort of easy. It's the opposite of depth. I mean, Ollie Gordon being the only guy at Oklahoma State, that's perfect. That's fantastic. From a sort of pure football standpoint, yeah, I mean, I think you have to give more consideration to sort of overall, how does the room look? I mean, West Virginia's, if we're talking about rooms, right, maybe as an individual, neither Jaheim White, CJ Donaldson are in that sort of top 5 discussion in the Big 12. But certainly, I think as a room, because you have two there who, they're good B plus, A minus kind of backs, both of them. Certainly, I think that's one of the best running back rooms in the conference versus say Oklahoma State. If we're going to talk about running back rooms, I love Ollie Gordon from a fantasy perspective. But if I were to grade the room again, I'm aware of Trent Howland, some of these guys behind him, but we don't know that much about those guys. And so it's sort of a top heavy room. Some of the other, rooms around the conference, I think, you look at sort of Kansas State with DJ Giddens. It's a similar sort of deal where if he goes down, I know they brought in a transfer from Colorado, but, it's very top heavy. So I think if I'm grading, the room, I really do look more about the depth and specifically, is there like a strong two deep? Injuries are going to happen. And so, the likelihood that sort of the first running back is going to be banged up at some point pretty high. So it's really more sort of that two deep as there's two strong, really strong running backs there. Most teams don't have three or more really good running backs, but you mentioned UCF, they've got a good two, or we assume they have a good two. We'll see. So that's kind of how I would look at that.
I mean, it's hard not to argue as Penny Boone might be the best number two, is a guy who had 1,400 yards,
Yeah.
7.2 yards per carry last year at Toledo. Obviously, it's an upgrade to a Power Four conference and a Power Four team, but I mean, that is what UCF and West Virginia are going to run the ball a lot this year because they got a
Oh,
ton
yeah.
of guys that run the ball really well.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the guy. Look, Ollie Gordon put up 1,723 yards on the ground last year, 6.1 yards per carry, 21 touchdowns. Runaway best running back in the country. Doak Walker went to him. I understand if you want to argue some other guys. I'm not even going to go down the list. Is he the favorite to you this year to repeat as RB1 in the Big 12? Or do you see a case for someone else? You mentioned DJ Giddens. I would throw in a Taj Brooks. Looking at guys where they're going to get the dominant number of carries for their team versus like, I think RJ Harvey's really good. They're going to use Penny Boone. I think Jaheim White's really good. CJ Donaldson's going to get quite a few carries. I think Devin Neal's going to get quite a few. We can talk about him a little bit. Well, Abu Sama is going to be the guy. Like, you have plenty of situations where there's the guy, but do you view Ollie Gordon entering the season as still the RB1 in the Big 12?
Well, yeah, it's hard to argue against him, right? I mean, but there is the argument for it is difficult to sort of repeat that amount of carries year over year. And one of the things that I've sort of been paying attention to this offseason is Mike Gundy's sort of incessant complaining about guys who are constantly asking for more money. You can kind of run down the list of who on Oklahoma State might be having, negotiations behind the scenes this offseason to re-up their NIL deals. Probably Ollie Gordon's one of them. Uh, and Gundy's kind of a wild card, and that's something that college football fans like about him. But from a fantasy perspective, it's something where it's sort of it's almost like investing in finance. That uncertainty just gives you a little bit of pause where it's like, I don't know, things could go wrong here, where if Ollie Gordon's holding out for money or something like that, or if he just sort of decides he wants to shut it down and prepare for the NFL draft at some point. These are sort of possibilities that you're kind of considering over there, just hearing sort of Gundy complaining. But as long as Ollie Gordon is playing, so you mentioned that we're going to talk about the O-line. Oklahoma State returns, I believe it's 100% of the snaps on the O-line from a year ago. This is a very effective O-line last year, obviously, that they paved the way for Ollie Gordon to win that Doak Walker Award. So that continuity is great, and Ollie Gordon's obviously a really good running back. Gundy, as a coach and as sort of an offensive system that they use there, they have had in the past a lot of running backs. Chuba Hubbard's another one that comes to mind. He ran for like 2,000 yards in 2019. So they have a history of huge usage, wanting to rely on one guy, and getting a lot of production out of one guy. So there's a lot of we can check basically all the boxes there for Ollie Gordon. There's just that one wild card sort of behind the scenes where I do wonder if there's some animosity there. But I certainly think in terms of if you were going to make odds, it's hard to argue against Ollie Gordon, coming off the season that he came off of. But there is a good group right behind them. You mentioned some of those names where, in a regular year, if Ollie Gordon wasn't there, I mean, these guys would be a surefire betting favorite to lead. Certainly the conference in rushing, probably, be one of the leaders in college football as well. Taj Brooks, at Texas Tech. This is a guy who saw huge, huge carry volume last year. And his head coach specifically mentioned how many yards that Brooks was away from breaking the Texas Tech all-time rushing record, which was 1,100 and something this offseason. And he said very explicitly, we intend to break it. So, and he's going to need carries to do that. So he's going to see a lot of volume. Their quarterback is still, nobody's quite sure if he's healthy yet, Baron Morton. So they could rely on the run game a lot this year. Both of the Kansas backs, right? Devin Neal at Kansas and DJ Giddens at Kansas State. Kansas State's another great system where if you think about the running backs that have come through there recently, you can think of Deuce Vaughn a few years ago. They love to give the running back a lot of carries. So certainly there's guys behind. a lot of really exciting names there. Abu Sama is another one. He's a bit of a wild card, right? We saw him, he was a freshman last year, had a huge game at the end in that end of the season. I think it was against Kansas State. And it was like 270 rushing yards or something like that. So if that's a sign of the type of usage and production that he's going to be putting up this season, certainly he'll be challenging as well. I think a wild card, sorry to give a very long-winded answer here, but a wild card maybe that people will want to consider as well is TCU's Cam Cook. So again, when we're talking about systems and historical production, right? And you look at that TCU offense, and they went from Kendre Miller, who was in the 1,000-yard running back, to Amani Bailey, who was also in the 1,000-yard running back. So that is a system, that's a staff that loves to find one guy and give him the lion's share of carries. And so, TCU, they've, from everything I've heard from offseason beat reports, Cameron Cook looks to be that guy. There's a bit of a concern about a hamstring injury later in fall camp. We'll see. But assuming he's healthy and he plays in every game, that's another guy who should be right up there competing for the rushing title in the Big 12.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned Cook. It definitely feels like a wild card kind of guy. Obviously, Trenton Battle was supposed to be in that kind of lineup of running backs for them. He dealt with an injury and we haven't seen him in fall camp since the beginning. And Trey Sanders sounds like he's kind of going to take on that backup role. They really like Cam Cook, so I like that wild card situation you're talking about there. Speaking of wild cards, like we haven't talked a lot about Cincinnati running back, any position group at all. But look, this is an offensive line. As I've been doing some research, there is some expectation of it being one of the better ones in the Big 12 this season. They return like the entire offensive line. You've got Luke Kandra, who is a solid offensive lineman, one of the better offensive linemen in the Big 12. Corey Kenner was a solid running back last year, 1,047 yards, 5.5 yards per carry, 5 touchdowns. Again, that offense wasn't very good, so I don't know how much of that was him. You add Evan Pryor out of Ohio State, a former four-star guy. He didn't do a lot at Ohio State while he was there, behind some really, really talented running backs, but there is some expectation for him this year. What are kind of your thoughts on the Cincinnati running back situation and the rushing offense for them this year?
Yeah, well, so Coach Scott Satterfield, who's, used to be at Louisville, he moved over to Cincinnati. I believe last year was his first year. So,
Mhm.
he was in his first year coaching. Cincinnati was in their first year in their new conference, albeit they were one of the better G5 teams, but still big step up in competition. There was an adjustment period. They had a rough time. All of the new teams, the four that joined the conference, they all had a pretty rough time. But Satterfield, historically, if you just sort of look at his time at Louisville, he's had several 1,000-yard running backs. They've had a lot of sort of seasons where there is one guy who gets the lion's share of carries, and they're extremely productive. I think the question is more on sort of the efficiency side. How effective is the offense overall? I think they have sort of established that Kiner is their RB1 lead dog. As you said, he had 1,000 yards last year, even on an offense that was struggling most of the time. So they return a lot of snaps on the offensive line. And again, this is, for in my business or on my side, on the fantasy side, if you're trying to project production in the future, one of the best indicators for running backs is really, how many snaps on the offensive line are they returning. Now, that can be a good or a bad thing. If they weren't a great running team the year before, maybe that's not such a great thing. But generally, returning a lot of experience on the offensive line is usually a good thing for the run game. Cincinnati returns a lot of snaps. As I mentioned, Satterfield, his system, in the past has been productive for that running back position. Kiner, he's bounced around. You mentioned sort of his background. He's been in college football for several seasons now. I think year two of him being sort of the established starter there at Cincinnati, we should expect sort of a step up. But I think the question really is more about how Cincinnati overall as an offense, like if they're more effective as an offense, then Kiner is going to have nice bump up in production. It's not so much a question of do they want to give him the carries. I think we've established that it's more just on the efficiency end of what is he going to do with those carries. You mentioned it though, his yards per carry last year was actually pretty good. So, I think we'll see because they had a running quarterback last year, Emory Jones. By all accounts, they have another one this year. His name escapes me, but Brendan Sorsby from Indiana. So he's a quarterback who he's going to steal some red zone rushing touchdowns, and he's going to get his in the rushing game as well. But if Cincinnati is at least throwing their weight around in conference, there should be enough to go around for both the running back and the quarterback there. But again, this Big 12 conference, at every team you look, right? Cincinnati's one of them. They have a running back who, you could see them being in the top 5 rushing in that conference. I mean, there's the argument to be made. So it's such a deep conference with so many good running backs. It's hard to sort of say, well, Kiner is definitely a guy I see being top 5. He could be, but the competition's stiff, right, in the conference. So we'll see.
But we've talked about the names we all know and have talked about all off season: Devin Neal, DJ Giddens, Ollie Gordon, Taj Brooks, RJ Harvey. Looking at the rest of the running backs in the Big 12 this year, as we mentioned, the depth is absolutely here in this conference. There's going to be guys that would be RB1 consideration, except that, there's Taj Brooks and Ollie Gordon. It's a 16-team conference, and everyone's going to have this problem, but there's going to be other guys that step up, and their fans are going to go, he should be talked about more, but falls behind as far as the conversation goes because of how many good ones there are. Who are some of the guys that, if you were going to look ahead to the end of the season, you would say this guy is gonna have a more impressive season than the amount of publicity he's getting right now?
Well, the answer would have been easy earlier this offseason. And I think you sort of read this article that I put out, LJ Martin at BYU. So again, like, I'm not really sure what his status is, because his coach said he's not going to be playing, or is in jeopardy of not playing for the first 4 or 5 games of the season. LJ Martin himself then comes out and says he's expecting to play week 1. So I don't know really what to expect there, but I'll say this, I guess. If LJ Martin's healthy, let's just say hypothetically he starts week 1 and plays every game, I think that situation is sort of primed for him to have an extremely productive season, because they're going to have to rely on the run game. And by all accounts, from what I can tell from the quotes from the coaches themselves, he is the best running back that they have, probably their best offensive player. He's entering his 2nd year. He played a lot for them as a freshman last year. He was extremely productive as a high school football player in Texas. Came in as a big athlete. I mean, he's like 6'2", 200, came in as a freshman. So he already had sort of size to take on sort of that workhorse role. By all accounts, from what I've heard this offseason, he's added weight. So he's added sort of that body armor and should be able to withstand the sort of volume that would be required to be a 1,500-yard running back. The question is really, is he healthy? Is he going to play? I mean, he sort of has this lingering shoulder injury, I think, from last year, which could limit him. So the answer would have been easy, LJ Martin, but I'm not sure if he's healthy. But if he is, that would be my answer. Another guy would be, you could look at some of the new entrants, look at those Arizona teams. With the Wildcats, you have 2. There's Quayle Conley, who came over with his head coach from San Jose State. He had a productive season last year. And then there's Ja'Cory Merritt, who also transferred. He came in from New Mexico. He had a really productive season last year. Unfortunately, though, if they're both healthy and both playing, I don't see one, sort of taking on all of the carries. They're both going to get a lot of carries, and by extension, neither are going to have a huge statistical season, assuming Arizona isn't insanely efficient, which, I'd be surprised if that were the case. But if you look at their in-state rival, you look at Arizona State. Speaking of transfers, Cameron Scatterbo transferred last offseason from Sacramento State, came up from the FCS. Some have sort of compared him to Cody Schrader, who was Missouri's running back last year, former FCS running back who transferred up, had a really productive season. Scatterbo entering his 2nd year at Arizona State. Arizona State kind of got gutted this offseason, lost, their best wide receiver, Elijah Badger, some quarterback attrition there of Jaden Rashada. Not really sure what that offense is going to look like, but Scatterbo is one of the nice sort of linchpins. It was consistent from sort of last year to this year, that could offer some stability there. He was already a guy that they gave a lot of carries and used in a myriad of different ways. So they use him in the receiving game. He even passed a few passes last year. So they get creative with him. And playing in the Big 12, it's not that different from the Pac, where defense is optional, for a lot of these teams. Just calling it how I see it here. And so it should be a conference where Scatterbo, his skills from what he did in the Pac-12, I don't think this is really a big difference in terms of talent level or competition level. He's pretty productive last year, so yeah, Scatterbo could be a guy where for whatever reason people aren't really talking about him. I guess the Arizona teams aren't really sort of national teams that people talk about, but he's a guy who, because they like to use him in a lot of ways, and he could be relied on a lot by them.
You look, I think there are other players on those teams. For Arizona, there's other guys that are outshining the running game. That's not the focus. And for Arizona State, there's expectations, they might be the worst team in the Big 12 this year. So they're just not getting a lot of conversation, period. Utah, it's kind of similar to Arizona, one of the other 4 schools that have come into the conference. The focus is on Cam Rising and tight end there. But running back is going to be important for this offense. And we know Utah's going to have a good offensive line. They always do. They're very good on the lines. Running back seems like I don't feel like there's a guy at this point where it's just like, it's him. He is the guy. Well, obviously, Micah Bernard's kind of the expected starter. You throw in Mike Mitchell and you throw in Jalen Glover. You look at this situation, it feels like there's a solid 3 deep at running back for Utah. What's kind of your expectations for this Utah backfield?
Yeah, so and you mentioned the names. So from what I've heard is they are going to start the season with a committee approach with those 3, Micah Bernard, Jalen Glover, Mike Mitchell. Bernard, sort of the veteran, he's been around forever. He's basically been the starter-ish there. I mean, even last year, Jaquindon Jackson, Bernard, and him were kind of the 2 starters. Jalen Glover, people were really excited about him when he got there to Utah. He was extremely productive in Florida in high school. And, his tape looked fantastic in high school, but it hasn't really translated so far in college. I mean, they've tried to give him opportunities. He's had games where he's had 20 something carries, but he has usually like 3 point something yards per carry. Like he's just not been effective with the opportunities he's been given so far. And then Mike Mitchell, he's a young guy. I actually recently did an article on him, another running back from Florida. He was a freshman last year, redshirt freshman, I think this year, because he only played in 1 game, didn't really do much last year. But he has garnered a lot of buzz this offseason. I mean, a lot of buzz. Every coach, the head coach, OC, running backs coach, they've all mentioned him. And he's a guy where, he ran track in high school, so he has the speed. He's big. He's over 6 feet tall, over 200 pounds. So he has the requisite size. If he were to ever become sort of the bell cow in that offense, he could probably hold up. The question really is what happens sort of with that pecking order. I mean, they're going to start with a committee, and my understanding is if somebody takes the torch and runs with it, then they'll be the guy who sort of gets anointed. I mean, you sort of mentioned it, that Utah staff, and they've been around, at least the head coach has been there for a very long time, and he has a very clear preference. They want a guy to step up who they can just give the carries to. You can think about names in the past, whether it's Tavion Thomas, Zach Moss, some of these names who have gotten a lot of carries and a lot of production over there. So they want a guy to step up, but ultimately it comes down to, I think, are any of these players actually going to? So I think Mike Mitchell of that room is the one that has caught my eye. He's the youngest. He's the guy who's garnered the most buzz this offseason. And if there is a guy who's going to step up and really sort of take the mantle, take the torch, sounds like it's going to be him. But if it's going to happen, it's probably not going to happen until probably late September. So, sort of like Ollie Gordon last year, where, it sort of started off first 3 weeks, they were kind of using a committee approach, and then all of a sudden they just started handing him 20, 30 carries a game. Something similar could happen with Mike Mitchell, and with Utah, again, because they're so effective in the run game, it could be a case where even if he only becomes a starter, let's say week 4, he could finish the season, well over 1,000 yards and be sort of among the leaders in the conference. So I like that idea as well as a wild card of a guy that people aren't really talking about who could just come out of nowhere.
Yeah, definitely look, we're going to give you all a shot, and whoever takes that opportunity and runs with it, pun intended, is going to be the guy who gets the ball moving forward. I like the Oklahoma State comparison. Like Gundy every year is like, we're going to try and do a committee approach. And every time he says it, I'm just like, bull. You are best when you have a lead back. You do not do running back by committee. So, but whatever. I feel like running back by committee works when it's just so much harder to do in college than it is like in the NFL where you just have a bunch of talent. Like you have a guy. Like if you have a most effective run game, like, yeah, you need some backups and some other guys to take shots, but you have a guy who's going to get the rock, and he's going to be the guy that's going to get out there when you need something done.
Yeah, well, in college, right, you got to remember for a lot of these guys, you only get them for 3 years, sometimes 4 years. So, for a lot of these coaches, it behooves them to use them while they have them, right? I mean, freshmen, you don't get much production out of them. Year 2, maybe they become a starter. Year 3, they give you a good season and then they're gone, right? So you got to use them while you have them.
I want to wrap on this, and I hate to wrap on something negative, but I think it's the way to do this. Is looking across this, we're talking so highly about the running backs in the Big 12. We're talking about wild card guys, people you need to keep an eye on. Is there a running back room where you look at it and go, I either have just nothing but questions, or I am very concerned. Like I don't want to say like who's going to be the worst running back room in the Big 12, but that's kind of the angle I'm taking here of like where do you see running back potentially as a weakness in the Big 12?
Well, and I guess the easy answer here is Colorado. Um, they didn't really use the running backs that much last year, and part of that was by necessity. The offensive line was poor. Really, all they could do is Shadur is just say, "Hey, run around, try to find somebody who's open," and they did that 40 times a game. This year, I know just from hearing the quotes from the OC specifically, they want to be better on the offensive line, that of course, and two, they want more balance on offense. So they want to be able to run the ball more, and I think sort of their activity in the transfer portal signifies this. They're pretty active. They swung and miss on Rashad Amos, but they brought in Dallin Hayden from Ohio State. They brought in a couple other guys. I can't remember, guys who haven't done much in college, but looking for opportunity. You look at guys like Charlie Offerdale, I think his name is. There's August Dave as well. I say August Dave. Micah Welch is a young guy. So they've got a bunch of guys who are just like, they haven't really done much of that group. I think Dallin Hayden is probably the most sort of notable. On the fantasy side, people were really excited about him a few years ago because it looked like he might be the next one up at Ohio State at one point. Then he got buried on the depth chart. They brought in a bunch of transfers, etc. But he when he was given his opportunities at Ohio State, he was he showed to be quite good. He's very explosive. He's a little bit smaller, but he is very explosive. But I think again, sort of the easy sort of to answer your question, Colorado is the immediate one that comes to mind because we assume the offensive line is better. We don't really know. They've brought in some transfers. We'll see how that works. I don't think they're going to sort of ride one guy. They're probably going to cycle a bunch in. So even if it works, you're going to end up with a season where maybe 3 or 4 guys end up with 400 or 500 yards. So there's not going to be one guy that individually sort of stands out to you. Another one would be Baylor. Not necessarily because I think they're bad, more just because I have questions about sort of what they're going to do over there. Running backs coach has literally said he's a committee guy this offseason, and they've got a bunch of names in the rooms. Dominic Richardson, speaking of Oklahoma State, right? He was with the Pokes a few years ago. Gundy wanted him to be the bell cow. He just wasn't quite good enough. So they moved on from him. He moved to Baylor. And he's been okay at Baylor. He was okay last year, nothing special. There's a couple of young guys behind them, Reese White, who has had his moments a few times. But I suspect that will be another one like Colorado, where it's a room full of guys. You recognize the names, you've heard them elsewhere, but there's nobody really there that sort of stands out. And they're probably just going to have 3 or 4 runners who end up with around 500 yards or something like that. They're not going to have one guy who sort of pads the stat sheet. Sorry. So those are 2 that come to mind. But I've got to tell you, and we've been mentioning it, this conference, it's hard to really pick some programs out where that running back room doesn't stand out to you. I mean, 16 teams, probably 12 or 13 of them you feel pretty good about. I mean, even Arizona State, yeah, you mentioned they might be one of the worst teams in the conference, but like Scatterbo, at least on the fantasy side, he's still drafted fairly high by a lot of people, and that's because he's going to get a lot of usage. And when they score, he's going to be the guy who scores a lot for them. Like he's going to have probably a good year, even if overall Arizona State doesn't do well, he's going to do okay. So it's a conference where I'd say almost the entire conference, every running back room is looking very good. But Colorado and Baylor are 2 that stand out, but not because I think they're terrible, just more questions than answers.
Yeah, I mean, look, Baylor, I agree. Committee approach. Colorado is so many offensive line questions. I agree they should be better, but better is a relative term compared to,
Yeah.
better than what it was last year may not be that much better.
Yeah.
We've kind of mentioned Abu Sama at Houston. It's Parker Jenkins is the guy, and I think he's going to be a solid running back for them. He's going to get plenty of opportunity and carries there. So again, I think there's going to be a lot of good running backs that fans of their teams are going to be like, why isn't our guy getting talked about? And it's going to be because the top is really, really good. The middle is solid, and the bottom is, I mean, if Colorado is the worst, it might still be a decent running back room. So there's not a situation where like, this is terrible. Like everyone's got at least somebody you're excited about. So Justin, this has been awesome. I really appreciate your time joining us on the show. I am a paid subscriber to the newsletter. It is fantastic. I love it's a fantasy football angle, but I mean, you've written some great articles I've read the running back stuff a lot that just kind of puts an interesting perspective on some of these guys and the situations from that angle. do me a favor. Let everybody know where they can go and subscribe. I think it's worth doing. I really enjoy your work, so I want everyone else to have an opportunity to check it out.
Oh, sure. Well, I appreciate that the glowing words there. I appreciate you supporting as well and being a subscriber. Yeah, so I don't know if all my Twitter will be tagged on this video, but if it is, you can just click on my Twitter account. My link to the newsletter is in my profile. I write about college football, obviously. Love running backs. I love the Big 12. So yeah, come check it out. And I really appreciate you for having me on. This was a blast, and I'm happy to come on any other time in the future.
This will not be your last appearance. Justin of Volume Pigs, again, thanks a lot, man. We'll get you back on again soon.
Cool. Thank you.